Route 89 through Glacier County, Montana, had seen its share of accidents, but nothing like this. The ambulance screamed down the empty highway at 4:47 p.m., emergency lights cutting through the September twilight. EMT Tom Bradley gripped the wheel, racing back from a routine call in Whitefish when the massive German Shepherd appeared in their headlights. The dog sat perfectly centered in the road, unmoving despite the wailing siren. Tom slammed the brakes, tires shrieking against asphalt. The shepherd's dark eyes locked onto theirs through the windshield, not with fear, but with desperate urgency. "What the hell?" Sarah Chen muttered, reaching for the radio. The dog didn't flee when Tom honked. Instead, it stood deliberately, walking toward the tree line before stopping, looking back with an intelligence that made Tom's combat-trained instincts flare. Something was terribly wrong. What they discovered in those Montana woods would challenge everything they believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds between species. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Harold Hank Morrison had always believed a man should face his troubles alone. At 73, the weathered rancher carried himself with the stubborn dignity of someone who'd survived Vietnam, 40 years of Montana winters, and the slow, expensive death of his beloved wife Sarah 3 years prior. His calloused hands told stories of honest work, breaking horses, mending fences, and holding Sarah's hand through 18 months of chemotherapy that left them drowning in medical debt. The 40-acre ranch outside Glacier County had been their dream, but now it felt like a prison. The mortgage payment stretched Harold's veteran's pension thin, and the $47,000 in medical bills from Sarah's treatment haunted his mailbox like vultures. Still, Harold Morrison was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit defeat. Duke changed everything. The 7-year-old German Shepherd had arrived 4 years ago under circumstances Harold never discussed with neighbors. When pressed about the magnificent dog's origins, Harold would only grunt. Sometimes a man finds what he needs when he needs it most. The truth was more complicated. Duke had belonged to Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a young soldier Harold had mentored during Marcus's teenage years. When Marcus died in an IED explosion in Iraq, Harold inherited more than just a dog. He inherited a mission. Duke wasn't ordinary. His military bearing, the way he scanned perimeters, his uncanny ability to sense Harold's moods, these weren't typical pet behaviors. Harold suspected Duke suffered from his own demons, nightmares that made him whimper in his sleep, sudden alertness at unexpected sounds. They were two damaged souls finding solace in each other's company. Ruth Anderson thought she understood Harold's situation when she answered his ad for a housekeeper 2 years ago. The 68-year-old widow needed work to support her grandson's medical bills, and Harold needed help maintaining the ranch. What she discovered was a man slowly suffocating under grief and debt, too proud to admit he needed a caregiver, not a housekeeper. Ruth had watched Harold's health decline over recent months. His color was wrong, his breathing labored after simple tasks. Duke noticed, too. The dog had become increasingly protective, refusing to let Harold work alone, positioning himself between Harold and any perceived threat. When Ruth suggested a doctor's visit, Harold's response was always the same. Doctors killed Sarah with their treatments and bills. The morning of September 15th started like any other, but Duke's behavior was different. The normally disciplined dog paced restlessly, whining softly whenever Harold stood too quickly. Ruth noticed Harold's hands trembling as he poured coffee, his words occasionally slurring. "Harold, you need to see someone," she insisted, concern evident in her voice. His blue eyes flashed with familiar stubbornness. "I've survived worse than feeling poorly, Ruth. A man doesn't run to doctors every time he feels under the weather." But Duke knew better. As Harold prepared for his afternoon walk to clear his head, the German shepherd's agitation escalated. Something was terribly wrong, and time was running out. The argument that morning had left Harold's chest tight with more than just anger. Ruth's ultimatum echoed in his mind as he stomped through the house at 2 o'clock, ignoring Duke's increasingly frantic attempts to block his path to the door. "Then I quit, Harold," she had said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I can't watch you die out of pure stubbornness." Die. The word stung worse than her resignation. Harold Morrison didn't die. He endured. He'd endured the rice paddies of Vietnam, the slow erosion of his dreams, and Sarah's final months when morphine couldn't touch her pain. He'd endure whatever this was, too. Duke positioned himself squarely in front of the kitchen door, brown eyes pleading. The German shepherd had been acting strange for days, pawing at Harold's chest, whining at nothing, refusing to eat his usual kibble. Now the dog seemed almost desperate, pressing his 70-pound frame against Harold's legs. "Move, boy," Harold commanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Duke obeyed reluctantly, stepping aside with a low whine that sounded almost human in its distress. The September air carried the first hint of autumn's bite as Harold made his way along the familiar trail that wound through the pine forest behind his property. Every step felt heavier than the last, his breath coming shorter despite the gentle slope. Duke followed at his heels, occasionally pressing against Harold's leg as if trying to turn him back. Harold's destination was a secret he'd kept for 5 years, a small clearing where he'd carved a simple wooden cross into an old pine tree. Below it, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were the words, "SGT, Marcus Thompson, my son, in all but blood." Marcus had been 16 when Harold first met him at the county fair, a scrawny kid with nowhere to go and an attitude that screamed trouble. Harold had taken him under his wing, taught him about responsibility through ranch work, shown him what it meant to be a man. When Marcus enlisted, Harold felt the pride and terror of any father watching his son go to war. The cross came into view through the trees, and Harold's chest clenched with something that wasn't entirely grief. Speaking to Marcus here had become his way of processing the impossible burden of living when the young man who'd called him Dad couldn't. "Been a rough few days, son," Harold wheezed, settling heavily on the fallen log he'd positioned as a makeshift bench. Duke immediately pressed against his side, warm and solid. "Ruth's giving up on me. Can't say I blame her." The words came easier here, in this sacred space where pretense fell away. "Your partner here won't leave me alone, keeps acting like something terrible's about to happen." Harold's hand found Duke's head, scratching behind the ears that always perked up at mentions of Marcus. "Remember how you used to write about him? Duke saved my life again today, Dad. I swear that dog can see trouble coming before it happens." Harold's vision blurred, but he attributed it to emotion rather than the warning sign it actually was. "I promised you I'd take care of him, Marcus. But what if I can't take care of myself anymore? What happens to Duke when I'm gone?" The question hung in the pine-scented air, like a prayer without an answer. Harold tried to stand, to head back before Ruth worried, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The left side of his body felt strange, disconnected, as if it belonged to someone else. "Duke?" Harold's voice came out wrong, slurred and frightened. The German shepherd was on his feet instantly, alert to every nuance of distress. Harold tried to speak again, but the words tangled in his mouth like barbed wire. The forest tilted sideways as Harold collapsed, his right side crashing into the soft earth beneath the memorial tree. Through the gathering darkness at the edges of his vision, he could see Duke's face above him, intelligent brown eyes wide with understanding and terror. Harold's last conscious thought was of Marcus, 17 years old and home on leave, laughing as Duke performed tricks for an extra piece of bacon. The memory felt real enough to touch, warm enough to carry him into the darkness that rushed up to claim him. Duke stood over Harold's still form for exactly 17 seconds, long enough to assess the situation with military precision. His handler was down, breathing but unresponsive, pupils dilated, left side showing no movement. Duke had seen similar injuries in Iraq, knew the window for intervention was measured in hours, not days. The German Shepherd's training kicked in with crystal clarity. He couldn't move Harold to safety, but he could bring safety to Harold. Duke dragged fallen branches over his unconscious companion, creating a crude shelter against the cooling air. Then, with one last look at the man who'd become his anchor in a world without Marcus, Duke began the desperate race against time that would test every lesson he'd learned about loyalty, sacrifice, and the lengths love demands. Duke's paws hit the gravel of Route 89 at exactly 3:45 p.m., his military training calculating distances and probabilities with the precision that had kept Marcus alive through 3 combat tours. The highway stretched empty in both directions, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through Montana's wilderness where help might not pass for hours. The German Shepherd positioned himself in the center of the road, haunches settling into the disciplined sit that had earned him commendations in Iraq. His ears swiveled at every sound, the distant rumble of a logging truck, the whisper of wind through pine boughs, the barely perceptible wheeze of Harold's breathing carried on the breeze from 200 yards away. The first vehicle was a rusted pickup driven by a teenager who swerved around Duke with a blare of his horn and a string of curses. Duke didn't move. His criteria were specific, hardwired by years of training: emergency vehicles, medical personnel, anyone with the capability to save a life. A semi-truck approached next, air brakes hissing as the driver slowed but didn't stop. Duke held his position, brown eyes scanning the horizon with the patience of a soldier who understood that timing could mean the difference between life and death. Harold had maybe 90 minutes before the damage became irreversible. Duke had learned to count time in heartbeats during firefights. He could wait. At 4:32 p.m., the familiar wail of sirens cut through the afternoon air. Duke's head lifted, ears pricked forward with recognition. The sound triggered memories of medevac helicopters and field hospitals, of Marcus shouting orders as wounded soldiers were loaded onto gurneys. This was what he'd been waiting for. The ambulance crested the hill doing 65, emergency lights painting the asphalt in reds and blues. Tom Bradley saw the dog from a quarter-mile away and began pumping the brakes, experience teaching him that hitting an animal at highway speeds could be fatal for everyone involved. "Son of a," Tom muttered, bringing the ambulance to a complete stop 20 feet from where Duke sat, motionless. The German Shepherd's posture was unlike anything he'd encountered, alert but calm, purposeful rather than panicked. Sarah Chen reached for the radio. "We've got a situation on Route 89, large dog blocking traffic." "Not blocking," Tom said slowly, studying Duke's behavior. "Waiting. Look at him, Sarah. That's not random animal behavior." Duke rose deliberately, took 3 measured steps toward the tree line, then stopped and looked back at the ambulance. When the humans didn't follow, he repeated the action, his movements precise and intentional. "I've seen this before," Tom whispered, memories of his army service flooding back. "Working dogs in Iraq used to guide us to wounded soldiers exactly like this." Sarah looked skeptical. "You think this dog is trying to lead us somewhere?" Duke barked once, sharp, commanding, then trotted 10 yards toward the forest before turning back. His message was unmistakable. "Follow me." Tom made a decision that would haunt him for years if he was wrong and save him if he was right. "Grab the med kit and the portable radio. We're going to follow this dog." The trail was rough, barely more than a deer path winding through dense pine forest. Duke moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to ensure the humans could keep pace. Sarah struggled with the heavy medical equipment, but Tom's military conditioning served him well on the uneven terrain. "This is insane," Sarah panted. "We're following a dog into the middle of nowhere based on what? Intuition?" "Sometimes intuition is all you've got," Tom replied, though doubt gnawed at his certainty. They were abandoning their ambulance, violating protocol, trusting their lives and potentially someone else's to an animal's inexplicable behavior. Duke's pace quickened as they neared the clearing, his tail rigid with tension. He broke into a run for the final 50 yards, disappearing behind a stand of pines. Tom and Sarah emerged into the small clearing to find the German shepherd standing guard over what appeared to be a pile of branches and debris. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, recognizing the deliberate construction of a survival shelter. Duke began carefully removing the branches he'd arranged, revealing Harold's unconscious form beneath. The old man's face was gray, his breathing shallow and irregular. Tom dropped to his knees, fingers finding Harold's pulse while Sarah unpacked the medical equipment. "Massive stroke," Tom confirmed, his voice tight with professional concern. "BP's through the roof, pupils unequal. He's been here at least 2 hours, maybe more." Sarah was already on the radio, calling for helicopter medevac while Tom assessed Harold's condition. The old man's left side showed complete paralysis, his airway partially compromised. Without immediate intervention, he would die in this peaceful clearing where someone clearly came to remember. "Life flight's 20 minutes out," Sarah reported. "But Tom, look at this." She pointed to the wooden cross carved into the pine tree, to the barely visible inscription below it. "This isn't random. Someone's been coming here regularly. See the worn path? The cleared area around the tree?" Duke lay down beside Harold, resting his massive head on the old man's chest. His eyes never left Harold's face, as if willing his human to keep fighting. The dog's behavior spoke of a bond deeper than simple pet ownership. This was devotion born of shared trauma, mutual dependence, and a loyalty that transcended species. Tom found himself thinking of his own service, of the military working dogs who'd saved countless lives with their ability to detect danger, find the wounded, and provide comfort in humanity's darkest moments. This dog hadn't just guided them to Harold, he'd protected him, sheltered him, and somehow known exactly which vehicle could provide the help his human needed. How did he know? Sarah wondered aloud, stroking Duke's head as they waited for the helicopter. How did a dog know to stop an ambulance? Tom looked at the memorial tree, at Duke's military bearing, at Harold's weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work and harder choices. "I don't think we'll ever understand it completely, but I'm damn grateful we trusted him." The distant thrum of helicopter rotors began to echo through the forest, and Duke's ears perked up with recognition. He'd heard that sound before, in places where life and death hung in the balance. This time, though, he'd been the one to summon help. This time, he might actually save someone he loved. The Life Flight helicopter touched down in the hospital parking lot at 6:23 p.m., its rotors whipping autumn leaves into frenzied spirals as the medical team rushed Harold's gurney toward Glacier General's emergency entrance. Duke had run alongside the ambulance for the first 3 miles, his powerful legs keeping pace until the vehicle's speed made it impossible to continue. Tom had watched through the rear window as the German shepherd finally stopped in the middle of the road, letting out a howl that carried across the Montana wilderness like a battle cry of loss and desperation. Dr. Patricia Whitehorse was waiting in trauma bay too when they wheeled Harold in, her practiced eyes immediately cataloging the severity of his condition. 23 years of emergency medicine had taught her to read the subtle signs that separated the savable from the lost, and Harold Morrison was teetering on that razor's edge. "Large vessel occlusion, left middle cerebral artery," she announced to her team, studying the CT scan results. "He's got maybe a 2-hour window for intervention, but it's going to be touch and go." Ruth Anderson arrived at the hospital 30 minutes later, her face streaked with tears and guilt. She'd been packing her belongings when Tom called with news of Harold's condition, and the weight of her morning ultimatum pressed down on her chest like a physical burden. "This is my fault," she whispered to Sarah Chen, who was completing her incident report. "I threatened to quit, told him I couldn't watch him die. So he went off alone to that place in the woods." Sarah looked up from her paperwork. "What place? The memorial?" Ruth's eyes widened. "You saw it. Harold never told anyone about that spot. He goes there to talk to Marcus, the boy who died in Iraq. Marcus was like a son to him, and when he died—" She trailed off, unable to finish. The pieces began clicking together for Tom and Sarah. The memorial tree, the military precision of Duke's behavior, the obvious bond between man and dog that transcended typical pet ownership. Harold Morrison wasn't just a stubborn old rancher. He was a father, grieving a fallen soldier, carrying burdens that no one else understood. While Harold underwent emergency surgery, Duke had somehow found his way to the hospital. Security guard Jim Hendricks discovered the German Shepherd at 8:15 p.m., sitting motionless beside the emergency room entrance. Every attempt to move Duke resulted in the same response. He would allow himself to be led away, then return to his post the moment no one was watching. "That dog's been out there for 3 hours, Jim reported to Dr. Whitehorse during a brief surgical break. "Won't eat, won't drink, just sits there watching the door like he's waiting for someone." Dr. Whitehorse stepped outside to see Duke for herself. The German Shepherd's bearing was unmistakably military, alert, disciplined, but with an undercurrent of anxiety that spoke of deep attachment and desperate concern. She'd grown up on the Blackfeet Reservation, where the connection between humans and animals was understood as something sacred, not merely sentimental. "Has anyone contacted his family?" she asked Ruth, who had taken up her own vigil in the waiting room. "There is no family," Ruth replied. "Harold's wife died 3 years ago, no children of his own. Just that dog, and he means everything to Harold." The surgery stretched into its 5th hour as Dr. Whitehorse worked to remove the clot that was slowly killing Harold's brain tissue. Outside, Duke maintained his vigil through wind and the first drops of an autumn storm. Hospital staff members took turns checking on him, offering food and water that he politely refused. Local news reporter Jenny Martinez arrived at 10 p.m. drawn by social media posts about the heroic dog who'd saved his owner's life. "This is Jenny Martinez reporting from Glacier General Hospital, where an extraordinary story of loyalty and love is unfolding tonight," she began her live broadcast. "A German Shepherd named Duke guided emergency responders to his unconscious owner this afternoon, and now he's maintaining a vigil outside the hospital that has captured the hearts of our community." The story spread across social media with the speed of wildfire. Duke the Hero began trending on Facebook and Twitter as people shared their own stories of animal loyalty and devotion. Video of Duke sitting stoically in the rain outside the hospital emergency room garnered over 100,000 views in its first hour online, but the viral attention brought unexpected complications. Hospital Administrator Margaret Walsh received a call from the County Health Department at 11:30 p.m., reminding her that state regulations prohibited animals from entering medical facilities except for registered service animals. Duke's presence in the hospital violated multiple policies, and if Harold survived surgery, the dog would not be permitted to visit. "I don't care about regulations," Dr. Whitehorse told Walsh during a heated discussion outside the surgical suite. "That dog is part of this man's recovery. I've seen what happens when we separate bonded companions. The patient gives up, stops fighting." Walsh remained firm. "Patricia, I understand your concerns, but we can't make exceptions. If we allow one animal, where does it end? What about insurance liability? Health department violations?" Their argument was interrupted by a commotion from the emergency room. Duke had somehow gotten inside the building and was standing at the elevator, pressing the call button with his nose. Security guards approached cautiously, but the German Shepherd showed no aggression, only an urgent need to reach the surgical floor where Harold lay fighting for his life. Tom Bradley, who had stayed at the hospital to complete his paperwork, watched Duke's behavior with growing recognition. "I've seen military working dogs do that," he told the gathering crowd. "They're trained to operate elevators, open doors, navigate complex buildings. This isn't just a pet. This is a professional." As if responding to Tom's words, Duke performed a perfect military sit-stay, his attention focused entirely on the elevator doors. When they opened, he stepped inside and immediately pressed the button for the third floor, the surgical ward where Harold was fighting for his life. The elevator scene was captured on security cameras and quickly made its way to social media, where it generated even more attention. Calls began pouring into the hospital switchboard from as far away as California and New York, people demanding that Duke be allowed to see Harold. Veterans organizations rallied support, pointing out that if Duke was indeed a former military working dog, he deserved special consideration. Ruth had been sitting in the surgical waiting room since 7 p.m. when Duke emerged from the elevator and walked directly to her. Without hesitation, the German Shepherd laid his massive head in her lap, finally accepting comfort from another human being. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Duke allowed someone to stroke his fur, though his eyes never left the surgical suite doors. "He knows you," Ruth whispered, scratching behind Duke's ears. "Harold talks about you all the time, about how you saved Marcus's life in Iraq. He says you're the best soldier he ever served with." Duke's tail gave a single wag at the mention of Marcus, but his focus remained on the surgery that would determine Harold's fate. At 2:17 a.m., Dr. Whitehorse finally emerged from the operating room, still in her surgical scrubs, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. "The surgery was successful," she announced to Ruth and the small crowd that had gathered. "We were able to remove the clot and restore blood flow. But Harold's not out of the woods yet. The next 48 hours will determine whether he recovers meaningful function or—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Duke seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. As Harold was wheeled into the intensive care unit, the German Shepherd took up position outside the ICU doors, where hospital policy absolutely prohibited his presence. Margaret Walsh arrived with security guards, prepared to have Duke forcibly removed, but Dr. Whitehorse stepped between them. "That dog stays," she said with quiet authority. "Harold Morrison is my patient, and in my medical opinion, separating him from Duke could prove fatal to his recovery. If the health department has a problem with that, they can call me in the morning." The standoff lasted until dawn, when Duke finally lay down outside Harold's room, his vigil becoming a symbol of loyalty that would challenge everything the hospital thought it knew about healing, hope, and the bonds that make life worth fighting for. The crisis began at 6:47 a.m. on Harold's second day in intensive care, when his blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels and his heart rhythm became erratic. Dr. Whitehorse rushed to his bedside as alarms screamed through the ICU, but Harold's eyes remained closed, his body unresponsive to medical intervention. Outside his room, Duke paced frantically, whining in a pitch that seemed to resonate with Harold's distress. "Get that dog out of here," Margaret Walsh commanded, arriving with 2 security guards and Dr. Robert Chen, the hospital's chief of staff. "This has gone on long enough. We're violating state health codes, and if Mr. Morrison dies with an animal on the premises, we could face lawsuits that would bankrupt this hospital." Dr. Whitehorse looked up from Harold's monitors, her face grim. "His vitals have been unstable all night. Blood pressure's through the roof, heart rate irregular. It's like he's fighting some internal battle." "All the more reason to clear the area of distractions," Dr. Chen insisted. "Security. Remove the animal immediately." The confrontation that followed would be replayed on news stations across the country. As security guards approached Duke, the German Shepherd positioned himself protectively at Harold's door, but showed no aggression. Instead, he performed a series of precise military maneuvers: sit, stay, down, as if demonstrating his training and discipline. Tom Bradley arrived at that moment, having returned to check on Harold's condition. He watched Duke's display with growing recognition and stepped between the dog and security. "Wait," he said firmly. "I need to make a phone call." What Tom had discovered through his military contacts would change everything. Working through veterans' databases and old deployment records, he'd uncovered Duke's full service history. The German Shepherd had served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, saving 47 lives and earning multiple commendations for valor. More importantly, Duke's final handler had been Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, listed in military records as Harold Morrison's emergency contact and beneficiary. Marcus Thompson was Harold's surrogate son, Tom explained to the assembled crowd of hospital staff. "Duke isn't just a pet. He's a decorated military working dog whose handler specifically designated Harold as his caretaker." The revelation sparked heated debate among hospital administrators, but it was Duke's next action that silenced all arguments. As Harold's monitors continued to alarm, the German Shepherd rose and walked purposefully into the ICU room. Hospital policy strictly forbade this, but something in Duke's bearing gave everyone pause. Duke approached Harold's bedside with military precision, then gently placed his massive head on Harold's chest, directly over his heart. The effect was immediate and medically inexplicable. Harold's heart rate stabilized, his blood pressure began to drop, and for the first time in 36 hours, his breathing became regular and peaceful. "What just happened?" Margaret Walsh whispered, staring at the monitors in disbelief. Dr. Whitehorse had seen enough alternative healing practices on the reservation to recognize something beyond conventional medicine. "There's a connection here that we don't understand, but Harold's vitals are better than they've been since surgery." The media attention intensified throughout the day as news of Duke's effect on Harold's recovery spread. Veterans groups began organizing protests outside the hospital, demanding that Duke be officially recognized as a therapy animal. Social media campaigns raised over $50,000 for Harold's medical expenses within 12 hours, but the money couldn't solve the deeper crisis that was unfolding. Hospital board member Patricia Sullivan arrived at 3 p.m. with devastating news. The state health department had issued an ultimatum: remove the dog immediately or face closure of the entire facility. Glacier General Hospital served a rural population of over 40,000 people. Its closure would force patients to travel over 200 miles for emergency care. "I'm sorry, Dr. Whitehorse," Dr. Chen announced during an emergency board meeting. "We cannot risk the hospital's license for one patient regardless of the circumstances." The decision to remove Duke sparked immediate community backlash. Local ranchers and veterans formed a human chain around the hospital entrance, while news crews broadcast live coverage of the standoff. Inside, Ruth Anderson held vigil at Harold's bedside, knowing that separating him from Duke might destroy any chance of recovery. At 7 p.m., as security prepared to forcibly remove Duke, Harold's eyes fluttered open for the first time since his stroke. His gaze found Duke immediately, and tears began streaming down his weathered face. When he tried to speak, only garbled sounds emerged, but his right hand moved weakly toward the German Shepherd. "Duke," Harold managed to whisper, the word barely audible but unmistakably clear. Dr. Whitehorse documented the moment in her medical notes. Patient's first conscious response directly correlated with presence of therapy animal. Recommend continued access as medically necessary for recovery. But her medical recommendation carried no weight with the board of directors, who voted 4-3 to uphold the removal order. Duke would be taken to the county animal shelter within 24 hours, and Harold would continue his recovery without the companion who had quite literally saved his life. The vote triggered an unprecedented response from the community. Local news reporter Jenny Martinez organized a town hall meeting that drew over 500 people, while veterans organizations filed emergency injunctions to prevent Duke's removal. The story reached national attention when retired General Patricia Morrison, no relation to Harold, appeared on CNN, arguing that military working dogs deserved the same consideration as human veterans. Duke served his country with honor, General Morrison stated during the live broadcast. He saved American lives in combat, and now he's saving another American life in a hospital. If we can't honor that service, what does that say about our values? The pressure mounted when Montana Senator James Crawford announced his intention to visit Glacier General Hospital personally. His office released a statement supporting Harold and Duke's right to remain together during recovery, citing federal legislation that protected veterans' access to therapy animals. As news trucks surrounded the hospital and protesters maintained their vigil, Harold's condition remained precarious. Despite his brief moment of consciousness, he showed little improvement in cognitive function or motor skills. Dr. Whitehorse privately worried that the stress of separation from Duke might trigger another stroke, potentially fatal this time. Inside Harold's room, Duke seemed to sense the approaching crisis. The German shepherd had become increasingly agitated as strangers moved through the hospital, his military training recognizing preparation for conflict. He maintained his protective position beside Harold's bed, alert to every sound in the hallway, every unfamiliar voice outside the door. Ruth watched the drama unfold with growing dread, knowing that Harold's recovery depended on factors beyond medical intervention. The bond between man and dog represented something deeper than companionship. It was the last connection to Marcus, to purpose, to the will to keep fighting when everything else had been stripped away. As midnight approached on September 18th, 3 days after Harold's stroke, the hospital prepared for the most controversial decision in its 60-year history. Duke's fate would be decided by morning, and with it, possibly Harold's chance of ever returning to the life he'd built in the shadow of loss and the hope of redemption. The devastating blow came at 8:30 a.m. on September 19th, delivered by a stone-faced representative from the county health department. Duke had to be removed within 2 hours, or Glacier General Hospital would face immediate closure. No appeals, no extensions, no exceptions for military service or viral fame. The decision was final. Dr. Whitehorse stood in Harold's room, watching the old man's peaceful sleep as Duke maintained his vigil beside the bed. Harold's recovery had been remarkable. His speech was returning, limited movement had resumed in his left arm, and his cognitive function showed steady improvement. All of this progress directly coincided with Duke's presence, a correlation she documented meticulously but couldn't convince administrators to accept. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Duke, whose intelligent brown eyes seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. "I fought as hard as I could." Ruth Anderson had been crying since dawn, knowing that Harold's reaction to Duke's removal might trigger another stroke. She'd watched their bond deepen over 4 years, seen how Duke anchored Harold to life after Sarah's death and Marcus's loss. Separating them now felt like a death sentence disguised as hospital policy. Animal Control Officer Janet Mills arrived with a heavy heart and a legal warrant. She'd followed Duke's story in the news, had even donated to the fundraising campaign for Harold's medical bills. But the law was the law, and her job required enforcement regardless of personal feelings. "I'll make sure he's treated well at the shelter," she promised Ruth, though they both knew that Duke would likely refuse food and water just as he had during his hospital vigil. Military working dogs were trained for loyalty unto death. Duke wouldn't abandon his post easily. The first attempt to remove Duke failed spectacularly. The German Shepherd didn't resist or show aggression, but he employed passive resistance with military precision. When Janet approached with the catch-pole, Duke lay down beside Harold's bed and refused to move. When she tried to coax him with treats, he ignored her completely. When she attempted to physically lift him, Duke's 70-pound frame became dead weight, impossible to move without potentially injuring both dog and handler. The commotion woke Harold, whose eyes immediately found Duke and then the stranger with the animal control equipment. Understanding dawned in his expression. They were taking Duke away. Harold tried to sit up, his limited speech forming desperate protests that came out as frustrated sounds rather than words. "Duke, no, please," Harold managed, his right hand reaching toward his companion. Dr. Whitehorse intervened, checking Harold's vitals as his blood pressure spiked dangerously high. His heart rate's climbing. "Blood pressure's at stroke levels. If we don't calm him down immediately, we could lose him." But Harold continued struggling against his physical limitations, trying to protect Duke, just as Duke had protected him. The German Shepherd seemed to recognize his human's distress and rose to position himself closer to Harold, offering comfort even as his own removal became imminent. Janet Mills made the painful decision to call for backup. 2 additional officers arrived with specialized equipment prepared to forcibly remove Duke while minimizing trauma to both animal and patient. The sight of multiple uniforms entering Harold's room triggered Duke's combat instincts, not aggression, but heightened alertness and protective positioning. The actual removal took place at 10:47 a.m., captured on cell phone cameras by hospital staff and broadcast live on social media. Duke allowed himself to be led away without violence, but his eyes never left Harold's face. The German Shepherd's military bearing remained intact even in defeat, demonstrating the discipline that had earned him commendations in Iraq. Harold's heartbreak was audible throughout the ICU as Duke disappeared from view. The old man's anguished cries echoed down hospital corridors, a sound that reduced hardened medical professionals to tears. Dr. Whitehorse documented Harold's immediate physical deterioration, elevated heart rate, irregular breathing, and the return of stroke-like symptoms that had been absent during Duke's presence. Within 4 hours of Duke's removal, Harold had stopped responding to medical staff. He refused food, medication, and physical therapy. His eyes remained fixed on the doorway where Duke had last appeared, waiting for a reunion that hospital policy made impossible. At the county animal shelter, Duke exhibited similar decline. He refused all food and water, lying motionless in his kennel with his head facing the direction of the hospital. Shelter supervisor Maria Santos had never seen such profound depression in an animal. Duke appeared to be willing himself to die rather than live without Harold. The community response was swift and furious. Protesters surrounded both the hospital and the county offices, demanding Duke's return. Social media campaigns exploded with #BringDukeHome hashtags, while national news outlets picked up the story of bureaucratic heartlessness separating a war hero from his dying guardian. By evening, both Harold and Duke were deteriorating rapidly. Dr. Whitehorse made the unprecedented decision to issue a formal medical statement declaring Duke's presence medically necessary for patient survival. But her professional opinion carried no legal weight against state health regulations, and Harold Morrison, the man who'd raised a fallen soldier's partner and been saved by that same dog's loyalty, seemed destined to die from a broken heart in a sterile hospital room, alone except for memories of the companion who'd given him purpose. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source, a dusty cardboard box hidden beneath Harold's bed that Ruth discovered while gathering his personal belongings. Inside were 53 letters, carefully preserved in chronological order, each bearing the official letterhead of the United States Army and addressed to Dad in Marcus Thompson's distinctive handwriting. Ruth's hands trembled as she read the first letter, dated 8 years earlier. Dear Dad, I know we're not blood, but you're the only father I've ever known. The Army's making me list an emergency contact, and there's nobody else I'd trust with my life. If anything happens to me, please take care of Duke. He's not just my partner, he's family, and he'll need someone who understands what love really means. The letters painted a picture that no one in the community had fully understood. Marcus Thompson hadn't just visited Harold's ranch during military leaves, he'd considered it home. Harold hadn't just mentored a troubled teenager, he'd raised a son in all but blood. The relationship between Harold and Duke wasn't simply man and dog, it was the last living connection between a father and his fallen child. Tom Bradley was studying the letters in the hospital waiting room when a detail in Marcus's final correspondence made him stop breathing. Duke saved 8 soldiers yesterday when he detected an IED, Marcus had written 3 weeks before his death. One of them was a helicopter medic named Tom Bradley. Small world, he's from Montana too. I told Duke he's got good taste in people to rescue. The revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. He remembered that day in Fallujah with crystal clarity, the routine patrol that Duke had suddenly disrupted, refusing to let the unit advance until explosives experts cleared a massive roadside bomb. Tom had been the medic who'd treated the wounded when a second IED detonated during the disposal operation. Duke had quite literally saved his life, and now, 5 years later, the same dog had led him to Harold in the Montana wilderness. "Ruth," Tom said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you something about that day in Iraq." While Tom shared his connection to Marcus and Duke, another discovery was unfolding in the hospital administrator's office. Margaret Walsh had been reviewing Harold's insurance paperwork when she noticed an unclaimed life insurance policy listed in his emergency contact information. The beneficiary was Harold Morrison, and the policy amount was $247,000. More than enough to cover his medical expenses and Duke's care for years to come. The insurance had been purchased by Marcus Thompson through the military's life insurance program, with Harold designated as sole beneficiary. However, due to administrative delays and Harold's isolation following Marcus's death, the claim had never been processed. The money had been sitting in an escrow account for 5 years, accumulating interest, waiting for someone to file the proper paperwork. Dr. Whitehorse was examining Harold's latest test results when Ruth burst into the ICU with the letters and insurance information. Harold's condition had deteriorated dramatically in the 18 hours since Duke's removal. His blood pressure remained dangerously elevated. He'd suffered 2 minor seizures, and he'd stopped responding to verbal commands entirely. "Patricia, you need to see this," Ruth said, spreading Marcus's letters across the nurse's station. "Harold isn't just Duke's owner, he's his legal guardian according to military documentation, and there's enough money here to fund a therapy animal program for the entire hospital." Dr. Whitehorse read through the correspondence with growing amazement and anger. The hospital board had separated a military veteran from his service animal based on incomplete information and bureaucratic rigidity. Harold Morrison wasn't just some stubborn rancher with a pet. He was the designated caregiver for a decorated military working dog, with both the legal authority and financial means to ensure proper care. "We need to get Duke back here immediately," Dr. Whitehorse declared. "Harold's dying, and this separation is medically contraindicated based on new evidence." But Margaret Walsh remained adamant about hospital policy, even when presented with the insurance money and military documentation. "I don't care if that dog saved the entire Army," she said during an emergency board meeting. "State health regulations don't make exceptions for emotional support animals, regardless of their service history." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of Senator James Crawford at 4:30 p.m., accompanied by retired General Patricia Morrison and a team of federal Veterans Affairs investigators. Senator Crawford had driven straight from Helena after learning about Harold's condition and Duke's forced removal. "I'm here to ensure that a military veteran receives appropriate care," Senator Crawford announced to the assembled media outside Glacier General Hospital. "If this hospital cannot accommodate the medical needs of a man who served his country and raised a fallen soldier's partner, then perhaps it's time to review their federal funding eligibility." The threat was clear and immediate. Glacier General Hospital received over $3.2 million annually in federal grants and Medicare reimbursements. Losing that funding would force the facility to close within months, leaving rural Montana without emergency medical services for hundreds of miles. General Morrison had brought additional documentation that painted Duke's service record in even more heroic terms. The German Shepherd had detected over 200 explosive devices during his military career, directly saving an estimated 400 American lives. His handler, Marcus Thompson, had been posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for Valor, with Duke cited specifically in the commendation for his life-saving actions. "Duke isn't just a therapy animal," General Morrison explained to the hospital board. "He's a decorated veteran who earned the right to remain with his designated caregiver. Separating them violates federal protections for military working animals and their handlers." The legal pressure proved irresistible. At 6:15 p.m., exactly 31 hours after Duke's removal, Margaret Walsh authorized his immediate return to Harold's bedside. Animal Control Officer Janet Mills personally transported Duke back to the hospital, apologizing repeatedly for the trauma of separation. Duke's return to the ICU was captured on every news camera in Montana. The German Shepherd walked purposefully through the hospital corridors, his military bearing intact despite the ordeal. When he reached Harold's room, Duke approached the bed cautiously, as if uncertain whether his presence would still be welcomed. Harold's eyes had been closed for hours, his breathing shallow and irregular. But the moment Duke's familiar scent reached him, Harold's eyes fluttered open. Tears streamed down his weathered face as Duke gently placed his massive head on Harold's chest, resuming his protective vigil. The medical monitors immediately reflected Harold's improved condition. His heart rate stabilized, blood pressure dropped to normal ranges, and his oxygen saturation increased significantly. Dr. Whitehorse documented the dramatic improvement, noting that Harold's recovery accelerated the moment Duke returned to his side. "Welcome home, boy," Harold whispered, his speech clearer than it had been since the stroke. "I thought I'd lost you too." Duke's tail wagged once, then settled into the patient, devoted stillness that had characterized his military service. The bond between them had survived bureaucratic interference, media attention, and the threat of permanent separation. Together, they began the long journey toward healing, supported by a community that had learned to recognize love in its purest form. 3 months after the stroke that nearly claimed his life, Harold Morrison stood at the podium in Glacier General Hospital's newly renovated conference room, his left hand still showing slight tremors from neurological damage, but his voice strong and clear as mountain air. Duke sat beside him in perfect military posture, wearing an official therapy dog vest that proclaimed his new role as the hospital's first certified canine companion. "When I woke up in that hospital bed and saw Duke's face," Harold began, addressing the crowd of 200 people gathered for the dedication ceremony, "I thought I was dreaming. Turns out I was dreaming of a second chance I didn't think I deserved." The Marcus Thompson Memorial Therapy Animal Program had become a reality thanks to the unclaimed life insurance policy and an outpouring of community support that ultimately raised over $400,000. The program would train and certify therapy animals for rural hospitals across Montana, with Duke serving as the flagship example of how human-animal bonds could accelerate healing. Dr. Patricia Whitehorse had documented Harold's recovery with scientific precision, creating a case study that would be published in the Journal of Emergency Medicine. Harold's cognitive function had returned to 85% of pre-stroke levels, his motor skills had improved dramatically, and his emotional stability had strengthened beyond anything she'd expected. The correlation with Duke's presence was undeniable and medically significant. "The science is clear," Dr. Whitehorse explained to the assembled medical professionals. Therapy animals reduce stress hormones, lower blood pressure, and trigger the release of endorphins that accelerate healing. Duke didn't just save Harold's life in the woods, he continued saving it every day during recovery. Tom Bradley had undergone his own transformation, leaving his EMT position to become the program's director. His military experience and personal connection to Marcus Thompson made him uniquely qualified to train both animals and handlers. The program would focus specifically on helping veterans with PTSD, stroke patients, and terminally ill children, populations that showed the greatest response to animal-assisted therapy. Marcus Thompson died believing his service mattered, Tom told the crowd. Through Duke and Harold, that service continues. Every life this program touches is a life Marcus helped save. Ruth Anderson had been officially hired as Harold's live-in caregiver, using funds from the insurance settlement. But their relationship had evolved beyond employer and employee. They'd become family, bound together by shared love for Harold and Duke. Ruth's own grandson, Jeremy, had become a regular visitor to the ranch, learning ranch work and responsibility under Harold's patient guidance. "Harold's teaching Jeremy the same lessons he taught Marcus," Ruth explained to a local newspaper reporter. "How to be a man of your word, how to care for those who depend on you, how to find purpose in service to others." The insurance settlement had also allowed Harold to pay off all medical debts and make necessary improvements to his ranch. But the most significant change was the addition of a small cabin where visiting veterans could stay while participating in the therapy program. The first resident was Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a combat veteran struggling with PTSD who found healing through working with Duke and other therapy animals. Duke himself had adapted to his new role with characteristic military precision. His days were split between Harold's bedside during medical appointments, visits to other hospital patients, and training sessions with new therapy animals. His gentle demeanor with sick children and wounded veterans demonstrated an intuitive understanding of human suffering that amazed medical professionals. Senator James Crawford had returned to Montana for the dedication ceremony, bringing with him federal legislation that would protect therapy animals in medical facilities nationwide. The Duke Act would ensure that no other veteran would face separation from their service animal during medical treatment. "Harold Morrison and Duke represent the best of American values," Senator Crawford declared. "Loyalty, sacrifice, and the willingness to serve others without expectation of reward. This program will ensure their example inspires healing across our nation." The ceremony's most emotional moment came when Harold unveiled a bronze memorial plaque honoring Marcus Thompson's service. The plaque would be permanently installed in the hospital's Therapy Animal Center, ensuring that Marcus's sacrifice would be remembered by every patient who benefited from the program he'd unknowingly inspired. "Marcus used to say that Duke had a gift for finding people who needed saving," Harold said, his voice breaking slightly. "I thought I was just taking care of my boy's dog. Turns out Duke was taking care of Marcus's father." General Patricia Morrison presented Harold with Marcus's Bronze Star Medal, which had been held in military archives since Marcus's death. The medal would be displayed alongside Duke's military service ribbons in the therapy center, creating a permanent tribute to their partnership and sacrifice. "This medal belongs to both of you," General Morrison said as she pinned the Bronze Star to Harold's jacket. Marcus earned it through his courage, but you've honored it through your commitment to his memory and his partner. The financial success of the program exceeded everyone's expectations. Corporate sponsors had contributed additional funding, while individual donations continued flowing from across the country. The program would expand to 5 additional rural hospitals within 2 years, with plans for a regional training center on Harold's ranch. Duke's story had been documented in a children's book titled The Hero Who Never Gave Up, with all proceeds supporting therapy animal programs for sick children. The book had already sold over 100,000 copies, spreading Duke's message of loyalty and love to a new generation. Dr. Whitehorse had been promoted to Director of Innovative Medical Programs, with Duke's success opening doors for alternative healing approaches that complemented traditional medicine. The hospital's therapy animal program had reduced average patient recovery times by 23%, decreased medication requirements for pain and anxiety, and improved patient satisfaction scores dramatically. Duke taught us that healing isn't just about medical intervention, Dr. Whitehorse reflected. Sometimes it's about connection, purpose, and the knowledge that someone, or some dog, refuses to give up on you. As the ceremony concluded, Harold and Duke walked slowly through the hospital corridors, stopping to visit patients who had benefited from the therapy program. In the children's ward, Duke performed gentle tricks that brought laughter to young cancer patients. In the rehabilitation unit, he provided motivation for stroke survivors working to regain motor function. Their final stop was Harold's former room in the ICU, now designated as the Marcus Thompson Memorial Suite for critical care patients who could benefit from therapy, animal visits. A photograph of Marcus in his Army uniform hung beside the bed, watching over future patients with the same protective spirit that Duke embodied. "We're going home now, son," Harold whispered to Marcus's photograph, his hand resting on Duke's head. "But we'll be back tomorrow. Duke's got work to do, and I've got promises to keep." Outside the hospital, autumn sunlight painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and amber. Harold climbed carefully into his truck, Duke settling into the passenger seat with practiced ease. They drove home along Route 89, past the spot where Duke had made his desperate stand to save Harold's life. The ranch welcomed them with familiar scents and sounds, cattle lowing in distant pastures, wind whispering through pine trees, the creak of weathered wooden buildings that had sheltered 3 generations of Morrison family dreams. Harold's memorial trail through the woods had been expanded into a walking path where therapy program participants could find peace and reflection. As evening shadows lengthened across the ranch, Harold sat on his front porch with Duke beside him, watching the sun set over mountains that had witnessed their journey from desperation to hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients to help, new opportunities to honor Marcus's memory through service to others. "You did good today, partner," Harold said, scratching behind Duke's ears. "Marcus would be proud of both of us." Duke's tail thumped once against the wooden porch, a sound of contentment and purpose fulfilled. Together, they had found a way to transform tragedy into triumph, loss into legacy, and loyal love into a healing force that would touch countless lives for generations to come. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't between 2 people. They're between a heart that refuses to give up and a soul that refuses to let go. Harold Morrison thought his purpose died with his wife Sarah and his surrogate son Marcus, leaving him alone with medical bills, a failing body, and memories too painful to bear. But Duke, a decorated military working dog carrying his own scars from war, had different plans. When Harold collapsed in those Montana woods, Duke didn't just save a life. He restored a purpose that had been lost to grief and despair. Their story reminds us that it's never too late for a second chapter, that family isn't always defined by blood, and that the love we give away often comes back to us when we need it most. Harold discovered that taking care of Marcus's partner wasn't just honoring a promise, it was finding his own reason to heal, to serve, and to matter again. Duke showed him that loyalty transcends loss, that devotion can overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes our greatest calling comes disguised as our greatest responsibility. What relationships in your life have given you unexpected purpose when you thought all hope was lost? Have you ever experienced the healing power of caring for someone, human or animal, who needed you as much as you needed them?